Have you ever read Dr. Seuss's Horton Hears a Who? It is, while not a favorite in my house, certainly popular. It's a story of an elephant named Horton who hears something. He hears a sound and he's not exactly sure where it came from, so he stops and he listens. And he realizes there's a small voice coming from a small speck of dust. He still isn't positive what's going on, but he knows it's something and he listens closer. It turns out that that small speck of dust houses an entire population of whos. They live in their tiny buildings in their tiny cities on this tiny dust. And Horton vows to protect them. He carefully holds the speck wrapped in his big elephant trunk. But all around the forest are animals who refuse to believe Horton. They bully him, they yell at him, they call him stupid for believing in this tiny population full of tiny beings. They call him an idiot for carrying the dust around to protect it. They steal the dust speck from him and they hide it in a field of clovers, and Horton spends hours upon hours searching for the speck of dust. He will not give up, he will not stop. Improbably, he finds it. He takes it back into his delicate elephant care. And then they attack him and they grab the dust and they're about to boil it. And Horton begs the little whos to shout as loud as they can. And the mayor of Whoville runs around finding all the people, asking even the littlest child to shout. And with all their voices as one, the whos manage to finally make themselves heard. And the animals in Horton's forest stop torturing him and vow to help protect the dust. Over and over through the story, Horton reaffirms his vow by repeating the phrase, "A person's a person, no matter how small." That belief steadies Horton even in the face of his tormentors, and eventually those very tormentors echo that line, "A person's a person, no matter how small."
So there is a particular group of theologies that are lumped together for the purpose of study and analysis called liberation theology. Liberation theology is a family of theologies which holds that at the center, the practical aim of theology is the liberating of all of humanity from violence, oppression, and poverty. In these theologies, the divine mission of humanity is the liberation of all. So one branch of liberation theology has roots in the Catholic movements in Latin America. Another has roots in the socialist struggles of the turn of the century, and yet another in Black theology today. And so liberation theology pops up in places where people are oppressed and where the message of salvation is understood to have been brought to and through the poor, the struggling, the powerless. Well-known theologians in the tradition include Gustavo Gutierrez, James Cone, Karl Barth, Cornel West, and Dolores Williams. And while each of these theologians have different backgrounds, strategies, and traditions, what unites them is the insight that racism, misogyny, transmisogyny, poverty, oppression, all makes us all spiritually poor. The fundamental position here is that oppression harms everyone, even the oppressor, because it denies or disfigures the divine within each person. Liberation theology argues that it is outrageous to God and to the divine spark in humanity that the mass poverty of this country exists side by side with great opulence. These theologies are Christian, and these theologies argue that Jesus is found not in the triumphant march of American exceptionalism, but in the soup kitchens and the prisons, in the Black mothers' tears for the public execution of their children, and in the migrant families destroyed for seeking calories and warmth. Liberation theology teaches that Jesus came not to speak to the wealthy and to the powerful and to those whose voices are always heard, but that he came to give voice to the voiceless, to overturn the tables of the wealthy, and to bring a message of salvation and liberation to and through the meek the poor, the hungry, the outsiders. Liberation theology takes hold in the hearts and minds of folks who have faced horrible conditions and treatment at the hands of other humans, and yet who do not lose faith and hope in humanity.
I was taught that liberation theology is a Christian way of interpreting scripture and Jesus's life, not to justify slavery or imperialism, but to inspire the exact opposite, collective liberation. Liberation theology takes the tool of the oppressor, Christianity, which so often came along with invasions and conquering and the destruction of indigenous civilizations, and reads in it the initial true message of freedom and justice and an expansive understanding of the human family. Often we think of theology as relating only to God because of that root Greek word theo, meaning God. But in fact, theology can be understood as a system of religious belief, experience, and practice. In other words, we can talk about a theology, a set of beliefs and practices that orient a person in the world without necessarily talking about God. There's a theology in Horton Hears a Who. My PKs, that's shorthand for pastors' kids, are learning young that everything has a theology at work behind it. In Horton, there's an obvious one. Horton believes absolutely that it is his work to protect those smaller than him, which is everything on land, at least, since he's an elephant. A person's a person, no matter how small. And we might interpret that more broadly, a person's a person, period. Horton lives by this belief. The book intimates that he was prepared to die for this belief. But there's more theology that we can see at work in this story. Horton stops and listens. It's the first thing he does. He listens for the sounds that others can't hear or won't hear. And when he hears something and he speaks to the who's, he doesn't let the threat of the who deniers thwart him. He stands by the truth and the fact of their existence, and he stands by his own conviction that protecting them is worth his time and effort. Horton teaches us to listen, to find the actual, real, factual truth, and to dedicate ourselves to it, no matter who lies or denies or obfuscates or tries to confuse things. There are facts in this life and there are beliefs, and standing by both matters. A fact, of course, being a proven truth, and a belief being, we might say, a conviction that cannot be disproved. A faithful religious belief is not something that is proven to be counterfactual. If there are counterfactual things, then it is not a belief, it's a lie.
So liberation theology speaks of God and Jesus, of sin and salvation. Earlier this week in a class at seminary, we were discussing Unitarian Universalists and our commitment to justice and liberation. And the question arose, why don't we have a liberation theology? For many of us, the stumbling block isn't the fundamental belief that oppression of any kind is an affront to everyone. I suspect that most of us would agree with that. We get caught up by words like Jesus, God, sin, salvation. Indeed, many of us have liberated ourselves from theologies that have wielded these words as weapons against us, against who we are in all of our diversity and questioning glory. But when you read works by James Cone that tells us that Jesus is Black, or that Jesus said that the poor will inherit the earth, that the poor will inherit the earth, not be one among many who inherits the earth. When we read liberation theology as coming through the person of Jesus, it can be hard for us to see our theological reflection there. Jesus, while important to many of us and even the center of some of our meaning making, is not a shared foundation for Unitarian Universalists, in spite of our long history that stretches back to early Christian theologians. It is true, though, that UUism can be traced back through long lines of Christian heretics who believed in rereading, reinterpreting, finding a truth that oppressors have tried to crush. And here in America, the notion of universal salvation that the Universalists came to in their reading of scriptures, that universal salvation was a prototype for liberation theologies. It was not a doctrine which simply alleviated the fear of eternal damnation. Universal salvation was a doctrine that fundamentally shifted the understanding of God and humanity. It called its adherents to turn this world's injustice into justice, to reflect the grace and love of a God that would never condemn a single soul to eternal hell. Universal salvation asked humanity to take greater responsibility for the liberation and freedom of and material conditions of all people. Universal salvation says that we cannot simply shrug at poverty or racism and say that God will punish the perpetrators and the complicit, the jailers and the millionaires, and that God will free the rest of us. No. Universal salvation says that it is our job to create a world where poverty does not exist, where racism does not exist, where trans exclusion does not exist. Universal salvation tells us that it is not enough that we ourselves are not racist if our society is built in and through racism. It is not enough that we are not Jeff Bezos when his employees are on the brink of madness and starvation because their hours are indefinite and their wages are definite. And those wages do not even support their family without government assistance. Liberation theology, as bound up in and taught through Christianity, may not resonate deeply with us, UUs. But the liberation theology of universal salvation calls from our theological history and demands that we recognize that the entire Unitarian Universalist project is founded on one hope and one truth. The truth is that humanity is not free so long as it is chained to the injustices it perpetuates, and the hope is that these chains can be broken.
Humanity is not free so long as it is chained to the injustices it perpetuates, and these chains can be broken. That is the truth and the belief that we inherit. If we listen, we can hear the call in our own ancestors' voices. I have thought often in the last months about what they might have said about this moment we find ourselves in. What would Hosea Ballou have said? The preacher who absolutely believed that love suffused all existence. What would Theodore Parker have said? The preacher who understood his own call was to preach liberation and abolition with a gun on his pulpit because he knew he risked his life. What would these ancestors of ours say about this moment in American history in which fact is treated fast and loose, as though there were no difference between opinion and truth? What would they say to the divisions among us? What would they say about the greed and the racism and the oppression? What would they say to the lies and propaganda, to the religious self-righteousness that declares some sinners and others saved? They would preach their liberation in theology. They would say to me and to you that all people are made in the image of the holy, that all carry the spark of the divine, that oppression harms us all by means material and physical or spiritual and internal. They would tell us that humanity will never be free until all are free, that until we can build a world that reflects the divine in each of us, we will never experience the joy of beloved liberation. And they would tell us that it is possible, it is absolutely possible to change this world. Theodore Parker is the source of that quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." They knew that truth. They knew that we humans perpetuate injustice, and they believed, and they learned from their consideration of history and scripture and personal experience. They believed that the chains could be broken through action and love and compassion, broken by those of us who want to see a world in which all are free. And so they would tell us that we can listen for truths, abiding truths beneath and beyond all the noise of childish politicians and overblown celebrities and self-promoting billionaires, and that we can build a new world making for all people a better and brighter future filled with love, a shared future, because none of us exists apart from the whole. They would shout a hopeful liberation theology from their pulpits and from the rooftops, even as they listened, really listened.
We find ourselves in this moment because we have allowed oppression and prejudice to thrive. Whether through complacency or active cultivation, we have allowed social ills to spread and grow. And we know that we cannot conquer social ills using individual means. Universal salvation means that we must all create communities which are accountable to each other and to the least of us, to the most marginalized. We as UUs are not called to just tidy up our own moral conscience, but to build communities to overcome communal injustices. Theodore Parker tells us that humans never fall so low that they can see nothing higher than themselves. This message is at once an admonishment and a hope. We are sorely tempted to see nothing higher than ourselves, to place ourselves at the top, and yet in truth, we never fall so low as to make that possible. Always we can hold the truth of our power and our smallness in our hands. Our reading reminds us of this. Maya Angelou beautifully speaks to our smallness. Even in all our grandiose thinking about our nations and wars and power and money, we are nothing but a blink in the eye of the universe. We are called to remember this every day, to not sink so low that we think that there is nothing above us, to not think so highly of ourselves that we don't hear the cries of the who's on the tiny speck. We must understand ourselves as part of a long line of history. We must live deeply into our connections, into the truth of human living, and into the beliefs that bind us.
Yesterday, a friend shared a nugget of Jewish wisdom. There's a story that tells that Reb Simcha Bunim carried in each pocket a slip of paper. On one was the line, "For my sake the world was created," and on the other, "I am but dust and ashes." We have to hold those truths together. And with them alive in us, we have to build our world together. The title of today's service promised a visioning for what comes next. The reality is that what comes next is entirely up to us. As Maya Angelou writes, we are the possibilities. What happens down this road, that's for us to decide. Months ago, I remember saying to you all that I didn't want to go back to normal. I wanted to go back to something better. And I stand by that now in the wake of the election and as I imagine what might be built when the pandemic eventually ends. Normal wasn't cutting it, not by a long shot. Normal meant families torn apart, women's bodies treated as objects, trans folks harmed, Black men murdered, and so much more. The normal we had grown accustomed to was no good. We have to take advantage of this moment in which we have no choice but to slow down, and we have to start listening. That's a starting point of our shared UU theology, listening to each other, because each voice matters. Listening for the truths, for the sounds we haven't been hearing. And we have to listen not only to the voices of the past and the voices on the small speck, but also, as difficult as it may be, to the voices of those who have been led astray by their own wrong beliefs or by the manipulations and propaganda of others. We have to listen because all of these sounds matter. They're all part of the music that plays. And then we have to draw clear boundaries around what is fact and what is a lie. We have to recreate that common ground at least. And we have to stand by our beliefs that the holy moves in all things and that love weaves through existence. With the truth and our faith in hand, we have to stand on our Unitarian Universalist theology that declares that the fundamental mission of humanity is to create a world in which all are liberated, loved, and allowed to flourish in their inherent glory and wholeness. Ours is a liberation theology, one born in and created through community. Horton can't protect the speck alone. The whole forest has to come along. The road ahead might look different for each of us. You might consider if the career path you are on allows you to live your values, and you might make a change. You might consider if the way you invest and use your wealth is consistent with your beliefs, and you might make a change. You might consider if the way you spend your time is furthering liberation or contributing to oppression, and you might make a change. I don't know what it will be for each of us, but we're here to listen to each other and to work together as we navigate our individual and collective roles in the revolution for collective liberation. The road ahead is uncertain, but if we retain a deep understanding of both our greatness and our smallness, if we retain a deep understanding of the need to listen, and if we keep hold of our inherited liberation theology that must animate all our living, we can build something amazing.